In the depths of winter, silence has a sound all its own. It wraps around the soul like a blanket of frost, preserving, numbing, protecting. For Mason Reed, that silence had been his only companion for 3 long years, ever since Afghanistan took everything he believed in. The isolation of the Montana wilderness suited a man running from ghosts, from memories that wouldn't fade, from a past that wouldn't die. But nature has its own way of shattering even the most carefully constructed solitude. Sometimes redemption comes not in human form, but on 4 legs with wild eyes that somehow see right through you. Sometimes the greatest connections form in the most desperate moments, when survival hangs by a thread as thin and fragile as a single breath in the bitter cold. What happens when a man who has given up on saving lives is suddenly the only hope for creatures that shouldn't trust him at all? What awakens when the healer who couldn't heal himself becomes the last chance for a family fighting impossible odds? In the silence of the snowfall, fate was about to answer. The wind howled across the Montana wilderness, a banshee's wail that carried ice and desperation in equal measure. Snow whipped into frenzied spirals, obscuring everything beyond arm's length in a white void. Through this maelstrom, a figure struggled knee-deep in a half-frozen creek, his gloved hands gripping the halter of a trapped horse. Mason Reed's lungs burned with each inhale of frigid air. The horse, a bay mare with terror-wide eyes, thrashed against the ice that had given way beneath her, plunging her hindquarters into the numbing water. Blood from a cut on her flank painted the surrounding slush a vivid crimson. "Easy!" Mason shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I've got you! Just stay still." The horse's eyes locked with his, desperate and pleading. In that wild gaze, Mason saw something that made his heart stutter, recognition of a shared fate. Suddenly, those equine eyes morphed into human ones, dark pupils dilating in the dust-filled light of Afghanistan. A young soldier, blood bubbling from his lips, clutching Mason's wrist with fading strength. "Doc, am I gonna make it?" The explosion that followed tore through Mason's consciousness, merging with the howling wind. Mason jerked upright in his narrow bed, sweat plastering his shirt to his skin, despite the sub-zero temperature in the cabin. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the dim light. Outside, the same howling wind from his nightmare rattled the windows of the old forest ranger station he now called home. He ran trembling fingers through his graying hair, then reached for the bottle of pills on his nightstand. His hand hovered over the orange plastic, hesitated, then withdrew. Instead, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and pressed his bare feet against the cold wooden floor, using the shock to ground himself in reality. The cabin was Spartan. A wood stove in one corner provided the only heat. A small kitchenette with minimal supplies occupied another, and a desk covered with weather charts and a logbook completed the living space. The walls were bare except for a map of the surrounding wilderness and a faded photograph of a ranch turned face down. Mason's old pocket watch sat on the nightstand, its worn silver case reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through frost-rimmed windows. He never opened it upon waking from the nightmares. Some ghosts were better left undisturbed in these early hours. A grizzled canine form stirred on the rug near the stove. Echo raised his head, mismatched ears, one whole, one partially missing, perked toward Mason. The wolf-dog hybrid's amber eyes glowed in the dark, watchful and knowing. "Just the usual," Mason muttered to his companion. "Go back to sleep." The radio on his desk crackled to life with a burst of static, making Mason flinch. The weathered device served as his only regular link to the outside world. "Weather alert for western Montana regions," announced a mechanical voice. "The National Weather Service has issued a severe winter storm warning. This system is projected to be the most significant in 30 years, with accumulations of 30-plus inches expected in mountain regions. All residents are advised to prepare for power outages and impassable roads for a minimum of 72 hours. Mason crossed to the window and wiped a clear spot on the frosted glass. Outside, the setting sun cast a bloody glow across the snow-covered landscape, the light refracting through ice crystals in the air. The mountains loomed dark and forbidding against the crimson Sahara wilderness that had swallowed him 3 years ago when he'd walked away from civilization, just the way he wanted it. By dawn, Mason had already been awake for hours, moving through his daily routine with military precision. Check the thermometer, -15 Fahrenheit, record in the logbook. Split wood for the stove. Inventory supplies. Each task performed with meticulous attention, leaving no room for intrusive memories. He placed the old pocket watch on the table before preparing his sparse breakfast, careful to keep the cover closed face down. Only after eating would he check the time, an odd ritual that Echo observed with canine patience from his place by the stove. Outside, the coming storm had momentarily abated, leaving behind a stillness that felt more like a held breath than true calm. Mason pulled on his heavy coat and stepped onto the porch, surveying his domain. The ranger station stood on a small plateau overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. 3 miles to the east, a narrow canyon cut through the mountains, a natural corridor that wildlife sometimes used during migrations. To the west, dense pine forest stretched toward distant peaks. Echo padded out beside him, the wolf dog's nose working the air currents. Mason reached down absently to touch the animal's damaged ear, a reminder of when he'd found Echo 2 years ago, leg caught in a poacher's trap, ear bloodied from fighting the metal teeth. The wolf dog had snarled at Mason, then expecting another predator. Instead, he'd found an unlikely savior. "What do you smell, old boy?" Mason asked quietly. "Storm's coming back stronger, isn't it?" Echo's sudden alertness head swiveling toward the eastern canyon confirmed Mason's suspicions. The wolf dog's hackles rose slightly as he stared into the distance. Mason narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree line. Echo's senses rarely misled them. After a moment, Mason spotted what had caught the animal's attention, a trail of disturbed snow near the canyon entrance, too regular to be made by wildlife. Snowmobile tracks. This far into protected wilderness, motorized vehicles were restricted except for emergency services and forest rangers, neither of which had any business here in the depths of winter. Mason's jaw tightened, poachers most likely looking for elk or wolf pelts. He went back inside and retrieved his binoculars, then carefully studied the tracks. They circled around his property at a distance before heading deeper into the canyon. Deliberate. Whoever had made them had been careful to stay out of direct sight of the station. Mason's military instincts, dormant but never truly forgotten, prickled with warning. He returned to the cabin and took his hunting rifle from its rack, checking that it was loaded before setting it by the door. Then, almost as an afterthought, he picked up the radio microphone. The device crackled with static before a woman's voice responded, warm but professional. "This is Montana Wildlife Service, Olivia Winters speaking. Is that you, Mason? Over." Mason hesitated, his usual reluctance to engage warring with practical concerns. "Yeah, it's Reed," he finally responded. "Spotted snowmobile tracks near East Ridge Canyon this morning. Thought you should know. Over." A brief pause, then, "Thanks for the heads up. We've had reports of unusual activity in that area over the past week. Any chance you could take some photos if they return over?" "I'll see what I can do," Mason replied, already regretting the contact. "Storm's coming in fast. Should hit by nightfall. Over." "Mason," Olivia's tone softened, becoming less official. "Are you adequately supplied? This system looks serious. We could arrange a drop." "I'm fine," he cut her off. "Read out." He set the microphone down, ignoring the hollow feeling in his chest. Dr. Olivia Winters had been his assigned contact with the Wildlife Service since he'd taken up residence in the abandoned ranger station. For 3 years, she'd checked on him periodically as required by the lease agreement, though they'd never met in person. Her voice had become a constant, if distant, presence in his isolation. Sometimes in weaker moments, he found himself looking forward to their brief exchanges. Those moments of weakness bothered him. He'd come here to escape, not to form new connections. The radio crackled again, but Mason had already walked away, retrieving his snowshoes from beside the door. He needed to check the perimeter, make sure those tracks didn't come any closer to the cabin. Echo whined softly. "Stay," Mason commanded. "Guard the house." The wolf dog settled reluctantly by the door as Mason stepped outside into the biting cold. So, the day passed in gathering gloom as clouds rolled in heavy with their burden of snow. Mason spent hours tracking the snowmobile trails, discovering that they formed a strange pattern, circling through the canyon, stopping at various points, then continuing. Not the erratic movements of hunters pursuing game, but something more systematic. At one stopping point, he found a spent shell casing partially buried in the snow. Military-grade, not typical hunting ammunition. By late afternoon, Mason returned to the cabin, troubled and cold. Echo greeted him with nervous energy, circling and whining. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked, hanging his coat by the door. The first flakes of the promised storm began to fall as darkness settled over the mountains. Mason stoked the fire in the wood stove, then pulled out his logbook, making detailed notes about the tracks and shell casing. As the wind picked up outside, howling around the cabin's eaves, he found himself unusually restless. He finally reached for the pocket watch, opening it for the first time that day. Inside the burnished silver case, a faded photograph was carefully preserved. Behind a thin pane of glass, a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, dusty but smiling. Mason's thumb brushed over the face of the central figure, a young man with a distinctive dog tag necklace visible above his collar. "Nathan," he whispered to the empty room. The watch itself had stopped years ago, its hands frozen at 3:42. Mason never wound it anymore, letting it remain a monument to a moment when time had effectively stopped for him too. Echo's sudden ferocious barking jolted Mason from his reverie. The wolf dog stood rigid by the door, ears forward, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Outside, the storm had intensified to a full blizzard wind shrieking against the cabin walls. Then Mason heard it beneath the wind's howl, a sound that didn't belong. A high, tremulous whinny followed by a softer, more desperate one. Frowning, Mason grabbed his rifle and heavy flashlight. "Stay alert," he told Echo, then cracked open the door, immediately buffeted by snow-laden wind. He raised the flashlight, and its beam swallowed by the swirling white darkness. Nothing visible. The sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable call of a horse in distress. Impossible, Mason thought. No horses range this high in winter, especially during a storm. The nearest ranch was 30 miles away. He stepped fully outside, pulling his coat collar high against the wind. The temperature had plummeted with nightfall, and the storm was quickly becoming life-threatening for any creature caught in it. Mason circled the cabin flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness until he reached the dilapidated corral behind the ranger station, a relic from when rangers had used horses for backcountry patrols. The beam of light caught movement, a flicker of dark shapes against the white backdrop of snow. Mason froze, finger tensing on his rifle's trigger, then relaxed as his light illuminated the forms more clearly. Two horses stood beside the old corral fence. One was a silver-gray mare, tall and lean, with a flowing mane crusted with ice. Beside her, barely staying upright, was a smaller horse, a yearling with a reddish-brown coat and a white star on its forehead. The younger horse's right hind leg trembled visibly, unable to bear full weight. Mason approached slowly, expecting the wild creatures to bolt. Instead, the mare lifted her head, dark eyes reflecting that his flashlight beam. She didn't shy away or show aggression. Instead, she took a tentative step forward, then nickered softly. The yearling tried to follow, but stumbled, a pained whimper escaping as it caught itself. Mason's light revealed a dark stain on the snow beneath it, blood. "Easy," Mason whispered, lowering his rifle. "Easy there." The mare's gaze remained fixed on him, not with the wild fear he'd expect from feral horses, but with an almost human intelligence, and something else that made Mason's chest tighten. A desperate plea. He shook his head, taking a step back. "Not my problem," he muttered to himself. But even as he turned away, the yearling let out another soft, pain-filled whinny that cut through the howling wind and pierced something deep in Mason's chest. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. The flashlight beam caught the yearling's eyes, liquid pools of pain and fear. In that moment, something passed between man and horse, a recognition that transcended species. Mason saw in those eyes the same desperate plea he'd seen in the eyes of wounded soldiers, of civilian casualties, of a dying Afghan child he couldn't save. "Damn it," he whispered, turning back. "Damn it all to hell." The mare watched him approach, ears twitching nervously, but holding her ground. Up close, Mason could see her ribs outlined beneath her coat. They'd been starving, perhaps for days. The yearling's injured leg now came into full view, and Mason's medical training immediately identified the problem. Not a sprain or break as he'd expected, but a wound jagged and partially frozen. Kneeling in the snow, he carefully examined the injury without touching it. The yearling flinched, but didn't kick, too weak to protest. Mason's trained eye recognized the wound immediately, not from a fall or predator attack. This was a bullet wound. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through him. He played the flashlight beam over the wound again, noting the entry point and trajectory. Not a hunting rifle, the wound was too small, too precise. This was from a specialized weapon, the kind he'd seen used by Special Forces units. As his fingers hovered near the wound, a vivid flashback seized him. Desert heat instead of winter cold. The metallic smell of blood. A child's frightened eyes looking up at him as he worked desperately to extract a similar bullet. "Stay with me," he had whispered then. "Just stay with me." The yearling's soft nickering brought him back to the present. The young horse was looking directly at him, trembling from pain and cold, its breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Mason made his decision. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you both out of this cold." He unlatched the corral gate, swinging it wide. Then he went to the storage shed attached to the cabin and emerged with a handful of old hay left over from the ranger days. He laid it inside the corral, then stepped back, giving the horses space to enter. The mare hesitated, looking from Mason to the yearling and back again. Then with deliberate steps, she nudged the younger horse forward, helping it limp through the gate. Mason watched in amazement as the mare positioned herself between him and the yearling, protective but not aggressive. Once they were inside, Mason latched the gate and hurried back to the cabin. Echo met him at the door with anxious whines. "We've got company," Mason told the wolf dog. "Unexpected company." He gathered his emergency medical kit, extra blankets, and a container of clean water, then returned to the corral. The horses had huddled in the corner, furthest from the wind, the mare standing protectively over the yearling, which had collapsed onto the sparse hay. Working quickly in the worsening storm, Mason rigged a tarp over part of the corral, creating a makeshift shelter. The structure wouldn't last long in the building blizzard, but it might give them enough protection to survive the night. He approached the yearling, carefully speaking in low, soothing tones. "I need to look at that leg. I'm not going to hurt you." The mare snorted, ears pinned back, but didn't interfere as Mason knelt beside the injured yearling. Up close, the wound looked even worse, inflamed, despite the cold signs of infection setting in. Mason gently cleaned away the frozen blood, revealing the entry wound more clearly. "Military round," he muttered to himself. "What the hell were they shooting at you for?" The yearling flinched as Mason began cleaning the wound with antiseptic. His doctor's hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over. In his mind, the snowy corral alternated with dust-filled medical tents, the yearling's soft brown coat with blood-soaked uniforms. "You'll be okay, he found himself saying the words, a mantra he had repeated countless times to wounded men. "Just hold still. You'll be okay." As he worked, the mare stood watchful, occasionally lowering her muzzle to touch the yearling's neck. Mason noticed how she positioned herself to block the worst of the wind from reaching the younger horse. There was something deliberate in her actions, a level of awareness that seemed almost uncanny. When he finished bandaging the leg, Mason spread one of the blankets over the yearling's shivering body. He offered water in a shallow pan, which both horses drank eagerly. "That's all I can do tonight," he told them, feeling slightly foolish for talking to the animals. "The storm's getting worse. We'll figure the rest out in the morning." As he turned to leave, the mare made a soft nickering sound. Mason looked back to find her watching him, her dark eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw gratitude in that wild gaze. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. "I'm not sure I can save your little one." Inside the cabin, Mason hung his snow-covered coat by the door and added wood to the stove. Echo circled restlessly, clearly unsettled by the scent of horses so close to their territory. "They're staying in the corral," Mason assured the wolf dog. "Just for tonight." He sat heavily at his desk, rubbing his face with calloused hands. The encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Those horses hadn't behaved like wild animals. The way they looked at him, the way the mare seemed to be asking for help, it wasn't natural. And that bullet wound troubled him deeply. The snowmobile tracks, the military-grade shell casing, and now a horse with a precision gunshot wound, something strange was happening in his mountains. Mason reached for the radio, hesitating with his hand on the microphone. He should report this to Olivia at Wildlife Services. That was protocol, but something held him back, an old instinct from his military days warning him to gather more information before alerting anyone. Instead, he returned to the window, wiping away frost to peer out at the corral. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the dark shapes of the horses beneath the tarp shelter. They had survived whatever had been hunting them, made their way through miles of wilderness in a deadly storm, and somehow found the one human dwelling in these mountains. Coincidence? Mason didn't believe in coincidences anymore. A sudden movement outside caught his eye, headlights cutting through the blizzard approaching the cabin from the direction of the canyon. Not close, but visible as faint ghostly orbs through the curtain of snow. Snowmobiles, multiple engines, from the sound that faintly reached him. Mason doused the lights in the cabin and grabbed his rifle, taking up position by the window. Echo growled low in his throat, sensing the tension. The lights circled at a distance, sweeping the area methodically. Whoever was out there was searching for something or someone. After several tense minutes, the lights retreated back toward the canyon, swallowed by the intensifying storm. In the darkness of the cabin, Mason's mind raced. They were hunting the horses. That much seemed clear. But why? What made these particular animals worth tracking through a life-threatening blizzard? He glanced at his pocket watch, still lying face down on the table. Whatever was happening, it had just dropped into his lap, quite literally galloped to his doorstep. He could still turn the horses loose, pretend he'd never seen them return to his isolation. Instead, Mason found himself reaching for the radio again. "Wildlife Service, this is Reed," he said when Olivia answered. "Those people with the snowmobiles are back, and I think I know what they're looking for." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Olivia, there are people hunting these horses, and I think they're not just ordinary poachers. You need to get here as soon as possible." The storm howled outside, drowning out her response, but Mason had crossed a line. After 3 years of running from his past, he just invited it back in. Because something in those horses' eyes had awakened what he'd tried so hard to bury, the part of him that couldn't walk away from suffering, couldn't ignore a plea for help. Mason Reed, the man who had sworn never to practice medicine again, had just taken on 2 new patients. Morning arrived with eerie silence, the storm having temporarily exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Mason had slept fitfully, rifle within reach, waking at every sound. When he finally rose and looked outside, he was greeted by a transformed landscape, snowdrifts, taller than a man, trees bent under white burdens, the world sculpted into unfamiliar shapes. His first concern was the horses. Bundling up against the bitter cold, Mason made his way through waist-deep snow to the corral. The makeshift shelter had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, but as he approached, a silver head emerged from beneath the sagging tarp. The mare snorted, breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. She appeared alert despite the ordeal, shaking snow from her mane. Beside her, the yearling lay curled on the hay, the blanket still covering its body, now dusted with snow that had blown in. Mason's heart sank, fearing the younger horse hadn't survived the night. Then the yearling's head lifted, dark eyes blinking slowly. It was alive, but clearly weakened. "Tough little thing, aren't you?" Mason said softly, relief washing through him. He spent the next hour improving their shelter, reinforcing the tarp with additional supports and clearing away the heaviest snow. The mare watched his every move, maintaining her position between Mason and the yearling, but with less wariness than the night before. Back inside the cabin, Mason examined the bullet he'd extracted from the yearling's leg. His suspicions were confirmed: a 5.7mm round, specialized ammunition typically used by military and law enforcement, not hunters or poachers. He placed it carefully in a small container and tucked it into his pocket. The radio crackled to life, startling him. "Mason, do you copy? This is Olivia. Over." He crossed quickly to the desk. "I'm here. Over." "Thank God," her voice conveyed genuine relief. "The roads are completely snowed in, but I'm trying to reach you. I've commandeered a snow vehicle from the Park Service, ETA about 4 hours if the weather holds. Can you tell me more about these horses? Over." Mason hesitated, unsure how much to say over an open channel. "Female adult and a yearling, possibly her foal. The young one's injured gunshot wound. Not hunting ammunition. Over." A long pause followed. When Olivia spoke again, her voice had dropped to a near whisper. Mason listened carefully. "Do not approach anyone who comes looking for those horses. Don't even let them know you've seen them. I'm bringing medical supplies and backup. Just keep them alive until I get there. Over." "Copy that. But what's going on, Olivia? Why are these horses so important? Over." Another pause, longer this time. "I can't explain over the radio. Just be careful. These aren't ordinary wild horses. Winter's out." The transmission ended, leaving Mason with more questions than answers. He glanced out the window at the corral where the silver mare stood like a sentinel, despite her obvious exhaustion. What had she and her foal gotten themselves into? And what had he gotten himself into by helping them? Echo whined softly, pressing against Mason's leg. "Yeah, I know, boy," Mason said absently, scratching the wolf dog's good ear. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" He returned to the corral with fresh water and the last of his hay. The yearling Mason had started thinking of it as Ember, for its reddish coat managed to stand when he approached, though it kept the injured leg raised. The mare Frostfire seemed fitting with her silver coat against the snow, allowed Mason to come closer than before, though she still watched him cautiously. As Mason changed Ember's bandage, he found himself talking softly the way he used to with frightened patience. "My grandfather raised horses, you know," he said carefully, cleaning around the wound. "Had a small ranch in eastern Montana. Nothing fancy, just quarter horses mostly. I spent every summer there as a kid." Ember's ears twitched towards him as if listening. Mason continued, his hands gentle but efficient. "He always said horses know what's in your heart. They don't care what you say, Mason, he'd tell me. They care who you are." He smiled faintly at the memory. "Guess that's why I liked working with them. No pretending." Frostfire moved closer, her breath warm against Mason's cheek as she investigated what he was doing to her foal. He remained still, allowing her to satisfy herself that he meant no harm. To his surprise, she didn't pull away, instead lingering close enough that he could feel her body heat. "What happened to you two?" he asked quietly. "Who's after you? And why?" Neither horse offered answers, but as Mason finished with the fresh bandage, Ember nudged his hand with a soft muzzle, a gesture so unexpected that Mason froze. The yearling's eyes met his, that same uncanny intelligence he'd noticed in Frostfire shining through. The moment was broken by the distant sound of engines, snowmobiles approaching from the east again. Mason quickly gathered his supplies and retreated to the cabin, where he took up position at the window with his binoculars. 3 snowmobiles emerged from the canyon, moving in tight formation. The riders wore white winter camouflage, their faces obscured by helmets and goggles. They carried rifles slung across their backs, not hunting weapons, but tactical gear. They circled the area methodically, staying just far enough from the cabin to maintain plausible deniability about trespassing. Mason watched as one rider dismounted and examined the snow, near where he had initially found the horses. The man knelt, uncovering something from beneath the fresh powder, then held it up to the others, a tracking device of some kind. Mason's jaw tightened. The horses had been tagged and followed. That explained how they'd been pursued so relentlessly through the wilderness. The leader of the group, distinguishable by his slightly different uniform and the way the others deferred to him, removed his helmet briefly. Mason adjusted his binoculars, focusing on the man's face. Mid-50s, gray-streaked hair, cut military, short, hard features, weathered by years outdoors. Around his neck hung a distinctive chain with dog tags. Mason's blood ran cold. He'd seen that necklace before in the photograph inside his pocket watch. It was identical to the one Nathan Reeves had worn. The leader scanned the area, his gaze passing over the cabin, then pausing on the corral behind it. He raised his own binoculars, and for a heart-stopping moment, Mason thought he'd spotted the horses. But after a tense minute, the man lowered the binoculars, remounted his snowmobile, and gestured to the others. They turned and disappeared back into the canyon, their engine noise fading into the vast silence of the snow-covered mountains. Mason released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They hadn't seen the horses, but they knew they were close. It was only a matter of time before they widened their search to include his property. He checked his watch, still at least 3 hours before Olivia could arrive, assuming the weather held, and the clouds on the western horizon suggested the storm was regrouping for another assault. Mason made his decision. He needed to move the horses somewhere less exposed than the corral. The old storage barn attached to the back of the cabin, originally used for ranger equipment, would have to do. It wasn't ideal, but it would hide them from view and offer better protection from both the elements and prying eyes. Working quickly, he cleared a path from the corral to the barn, then prepared the space, laying down old tarps and what little clean hay remained. Getting the horses to move would be the tricky part. Wild horses didn't typically allow themselves to be led, especially into enclosed spaces. To his surprise, Frostfire seemed to understand his intentions. When he approached with a makeshift halter fashioned from rope, she didn't shy away. Instead, she stood perfectly still, allowing him to slip it over her head. Ember was more hesitant, but followed its mother's lead, limping painfully through the snow. Once inside the barn, Mason quickly closed the doors and covered the single window. The space was cramped but dry, and most importantly, hidden from outside view. He provided fresh water and examined Ember's wound again. The infection was still present, but didn't appear to be worsening. The yearling needed antibiotics, something stronger than what Mason had in his basic first aid kit. As he worked, Mason found himself continuing the one-sided conversation from earlier. "My grandfather would have liked you too," he said, brushing snow from Frostfire's coat. "He always said the best horses choose their people, not the other way around." Frostfire's ears swiveled toward him, her dark eyes watching him with that disconcerting intelligence. "Why did you come to me?" Mason asked quietly. "Out of all the places you could have ended up in this wilderness, why my doorstep?" The mare lowered her head, gently nudging Mason's chest with her muzzle. The gesture was so unexpected, so deliberate, that Mason felt a lump form in his throat. For a moment, it was as if she was trying to tell him something, that their meeting wasn't coincidence but design. Mason shook his head, dismissing the fanciful thought. Stress and isolation were making him project human qualities onto animals. Yet he couldn't deny the connection. He felt a wordless understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between man and beast. He left them secured in the barn and returned to the cabin to prepare for Olivia's arrival. Echo met him at the door, still uneasy about their equine guests, but less agitated than before. Mason gathered what medical supplies he had, then checked and rechecked his rifle. The encounter with the search party had left him deeply unsettled. Military tactics, specialized weapons, organized search patterns, these were not the actions of ordinary poachers or even wildlife researchers. Whatever was happening involved something far more serious. And the leader with Nathan's dog tags, that couldn't be coincidence. Someone from his past had found him, or at least found these horses that had somehow led them to him. The isolation he'd carefully constructed over 3 years was crumbling, and Mason wasn't sure if he was ready to face what lay beyond its walls. He opened the pocket watch, studying the photograph inside. Nathan's face smiled back at him, forever young, forever unaware of what awaited him. Mason had carried the guilt of that day for so long. It had become part of him, woven into his being like scar tissue. "I couldn't save you," he whispered to the image. "I tried, but I couldn't." Outside, the wind began to pick up again as the next wave of the storm approached. Mason closed the watch and tucked it away. Whatever connection existed between these horses and his past, he would soon find out. Olivia was coming with answers, and Mason wasn't sure if he was prepared to hear them. For now, though his path was clear, 2 lives depended on him. Frostfire and Ember had placed their trust in him, and Mason would not betray that trust. After years of running from responsibility, from connection, from anything that might demand his care, he had finally found something he couldn't turn away from. The doctor, who had sworn never to practice again, had taken an oath far older than his medical one, the silent promise made when a wild creature places its life in human hands. As the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Mason Reed stood at the window of his isolated cabin and waited for the past to catch up with him, for better or worse. The storm returned with renewed fury just as a bulky snow vehicle crested the ridge leading to Mason's cabin. He watched from the window as the machine labored through deep drifts, its caterpillar tracks churning up plumes of white powder. The vehicle finally came to a stop beside his porch, its engine cutting off with a dying whine that was quickly swallowed by the howling wind. The driver's door swung open and a figure emerged bundled in heavy Arctic gear. Even through the swirling snow, Mason could tell it was a woman, Dr. Olivia Winters, presumably. She struggled toward the porch, fighting against the wind, carrying a large medical case in one hand and a duffel bag in the other. Mason opened the door before she could knock, ushering her quickly inside. Echo retreated to his corner, eyeing the newcomer warily. Olivia pulled back her hood and removed her snow goggles, revealing a face Mason had never seen, but somehow felt he knew. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with intelligent hazel eyes set in a face weathered by outdoor work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, streaked with a few strands of premature silver. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice matching the one he'd heard over the radio for 3 years. "Finally, we meet in person." "Just Mason," he corrected automatically. "I don't use the title anymore." She nodded, seeming unsurprised by his response. "Fair enough. Where are they?" No small talk, no unnecessary pleasantries. Mason appreciated her directness. "In the storage barn," he replied, helping her remove her heavy outer coat. "The yearling's condition is stable but not improving. Bullet wound to the right hind leg, signs of infection. I've cleaned and bandaged it, but—" "You extracted the bullet," Olivia interrupted, her eyes sharpening with interest. Mason nodded, retrieving the small container from his pocket and handing it to her. 5.7 millimeter round, military grade. Olivia examined it briefly, then pocketed it without comment. Let's see them. They bundled up again and battled their way through the intensifying storm to the barn. Echo followed at a distance, still uncertain about this newcomer. Inside, the horses greeted them with soft, nickering sounds. Mason was surprised to see Frostfire approach Olivia without hesitation, as if recognizing her. "Hello, girl," Olivia said softly, stroking the mare's neck. "You've had quite a journey, haven't you?" She turned her attention to Ember, kneeling beside the yearling, to examine the wounded leg. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, revealing medical training that went beyond what Mason would expect from a wildlife biologist. "The infection isn't too advanced," she said after a thorough examination. "You did good work, Mason." She opened her medical case, revealing an array of veterinary supplies far more sophisticated than Mason's emergency kit. Working quickly, she administered antibiotics and pain medication, then replaced Mason's bandage with a more advanced protective covering. "These aren't ordinary wild horses," Mason said, watching her work. "Are they—" Olivia's hands paused briefly before continuing. "No," she admitted. "They're not." "What are they then? And why are military-equipped teams hunting them in a blizzard?" Olivia finished with Ember's treatment, then straightened to face Mason directly. "They're part of a special herd we've been monitoring. Mustangs with unique genetic traits. That's all I can tell you for now." Mason crossed his arms. "Not good enough, Olivia. I've got armed men circling my property horses with bullet wounds in my barn, and you show up with military-grade medical supplies. I need the truth." She held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed. "You're right, but we should discuss this in mud. It's a long story and we're both freezing out here." Back in the cabin, Olivia accepted a cup of coffee, warming her hands around the mug. Echo had finally decided she wasn't a threat and lay nearby, though his eyes remained watchful. "I'm not just a wildlife biologist," Olivia began. "I also have a background in veterinary medicine with a specialization in equine genetics. Before joining Montana Wildlife Services, I worked for a joint research program between the Department of Defense and the Department of Agriculture." Mason's eyebrows rose. "Military research on horses, not weapons research," she clarified quickly. "Biological research, specifically studying unique immune responses found in certain isolated equine populations." She paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "About 5 years ago, researchers discovered that a particular lineage of Mustangs in Montana and Wyoming possessed an unusual genetic trait. Their immune systems could produce antibodies against certain biological toxins that are typically fatal to mammals, including humans." "How is that possible?" Mason asked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding his suspicion. "We're still not entirely sure. The leading theory involves their ancestors' adaptation to native plants with similar toxic compounds. These horses develop natural immunity over generations. When we discovered this trait, a small research program was established to study potential medical applications." "Let me guess," Mason said. "The military got interested." Olivia nodded grimly. "Initially, the research was purely medical, developing antitoxins and treatments for potential bioweapon exposures. But then someone higher up saw potential for more aggressive applications. Weaponizing the research," Mason concluded. It wasn't a question. Yes, the project was split. The medical research continued under civilian control while another branch, classified in black budget, began exploring other possibilities. "And Frostfire and Ember are part of this research herd." "They're more than that," Olivia said, leaning forward. "They're among the purest carriers of the genetic trait we found. Frostfire is one of our primary study subjects, completely wild, but we've been monitoring her for years with minimal intervention. Ember is her foal from last spring, and preliminary tests show the strongest genetic markers we've seen yet." Mason processed this information, the pieces falling into place. "So these men hunting them are from the military research branch," Olivia confirmed. "About 6 months ago, control of the entire project was being transferred to civilian oversight after ethical concerns were raised about some of the military applications. But before the transfer could be completed, several key research subjects disappeared from our monitoring system. Stolen. We believed so until tracking data showed they were moving in natural patterns through wilderness areas. Then we realized they weren't stolen. They escaped or were released by someone inside the program. And now the military wants them back, Mason concluded. Exactly, but here's where it gets complicated. Officially, the military research branch has been shut down. These men operating in the field have no legal authority to recapture these horses. They're acting outside the chain of command. Mason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face tiredly. So I've got rogue military operatives hunting endangered research horses on my doorstep. Perfect. I'm sorry to bring this to your door, Mason, Olivia said sincerely. But when you reported finding them, I knew I had to get here before they did. These horses aren't just valuable research subjects. They're living creatures that deserve protection. Mason studied her face, looking for signs of deception. He'd grown wary of government narratives during his military service, especially after what happened in Afghanistan. But Olivia's concerns seemed genuine, her eyes reflecting real care for the animal's welfare. There's something else you're not telling me, he said finally. Something about why they came to me specifically. Olivia hesitated, then nodded slowly. I have a theory about that. When I heard it was your location where they appeared, it seemed too coincidental. What do you mean, Mason, before you came here, before you disappeared from the medical world, what was your specialty? The question caught him off guard. Trauma surgery, combat medicine. You know this from my file. Yes, but specifically in your final deployment, what research were you supporting? Mason found memories surfacing that he tried to bury. I was assigned to a special medical unit. We were officially there to provide advanced trauma care, but we were also collecting biological samples from the local population and livestock. Testing for, he trailed off as realization dawned. Testing for unusual immune responses to endemic pathogens. Olivia nodded. The same research program, different branch. You were unwittingly part of the early stages of what eventually became our equine genetics program. Mason felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. His final deployment, the one that had ended in disaster, had been connected to these horses all along. That's why they recognized me, he whispered. Somehow they knew. Horses have incredible sensory capabilities and memory, Olivia said. If Frostfire was ever exposed to your scent during research procedures even years ago, she might have recognized it, Mason finished. And in a storm, desperate for help, she sought out something familiar. The revelation settled over him like a physical weight. His past hadn't just caught up with him, it had been intertwined with his present all along, through unseen threads of connection that spanned years and continents. Echo whined softly, sensing Mason's distress. The wolf dog moved closer, resting his head on Mason's knee. The simple gesture of comfort grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of overwhelming memories. What happens now? He asked, his voice rough. We need to move them, Olivia said decisively. My team has a secure research facility about 30 miles west of here. It's officially a wildlife rehabilitation center, but it has the medical equipment we need and security protocols in place. 30 miles in this weather with an injured yearling? That's impossible. Not impossible, just difficult. I brought specialized transport equipment in my vehicle, but, she hesitated, there's another complication. Our tracking data shows a third horse in this area, an adult stallion, Thunderstrike. He's Ember's sire and the herd's lead stallion. If he's still alive out there, we need to find him before they do. Mason moved to the window, staring out at the worsening storm. Night was falling, turning the swirling snow into a dark maelstrom. Somewhere out there, a lone horse might be fighting for survival, another piece of this unexpected puzzle that had crashed into his carefully constructed isolation. We can't go searching tonight, he said finally. We'd be dead in an hour. But first thing tomorrow, if there's any break in the storm, we'll look for him. Olivia nodded, relief evident in her expression. Thank you, Mason. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you moved out here. A bitter laugh escaped him. No, it definitely isn't. Can I ask, she began tentatively, why did you help them? You could have ignored them, reported them later, but you didn't. Mason was silent for a long moment, the question stirring emotions he'd kept buried for years. Finally, he turned from the window to face her. Because they asked, he said simply, not with words, but they asked for help. And I've spent too many years turning away when someone asked for help. Understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes, not pity, but recognition of a shared wound. Mason realized she too carried burdens invisible but heavy. "We should check on them again before it gets too dark," he said, changing the subject. "And you can tell me more about this facility of yours." As they prepared to brave the storm again, Mason caught sight of his pocket watch on the table. For the first time in years, he felt a slight loosening of the grief that had wound itself around his heart like barbed wire. These horses with their mysterious past and uncertain future had awakened something in him. He'd thought long dead, a willingness to care, to connect, to help. Whether that awakening would lead to healing or further pain remained to be seen. But as he followed Olivia into the howling storm, Mason Reed took his first step back toward the world of the living, guided by the silent call of wild horses who had somehow known to find him. Dawn brought little relief from the storm's fury. Mason woke to the persistent howl of wind rattling the cabin windows, his sleep having been fitful at best. Olivia had taken the small couch while he'd insisted on sleeping in his chair, rifle across his lap, old habits of vigilance resurfacing with the threat of armed pursuers. The night had passed without incident, but the weather had worsened, temperatures plummeting to dangerous levels. Their plans to search for thunderstrike would have to wait. Mason found Olivia already awake, studying a topographical map she'd spread across his desk. She'd marked several locations with small X's, creating a pattern that roughly followed the eastern canyon. "Possible shelter points," she explained without looking up. "Places a horse might seek refuge during a storm like this." "If he's still alive," Mason said grimly, stoking the fire in the wood stove. "Thunderstrike is remarkably resilient," Olivia replied, a hint of admiration in her voice. "He's survived 3 brutal winters in the wild, not to mention multiple confrontations with both predators and rival stallions." Mason poured coffee for them both, then joined her at the map. "These canyons can be death traps in winter. Flash freezes, avalanches, hidden crevasses under the snow." "I'm aware," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I also know Thunderstrike has an almost supernatural ability to find safe passages. And he'll be searching for Frostfire and Ember family bonds in this particular herd are unusually strong." Mason studied her as she traced potential routes with her finger. There was something personal in her connection to these horses beyond professional interest. "How long have you been tracking them?" he asked. "This specific family group almost 4 years," she answered. "I was there when Ember was born. Thunderstrike kept the other stallions at bay, while Frostfire delivered, then stood guard for 3 days straight while the foal gained strength." "That's unusual behavior for wild horses," Mason noted. Olivia nodded. "Everything about them is unusual. Their intelligence, their social structures, their ability to problem solve. It's why I fought so hard to protect them from the military research." A piece clicked into place for Mason. "You were the whistleblower, weren't it you? The ethical concerns that led to civilian oversight." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, when I discovered they were performing invasive procedures without proper anesthesia or recovery protocols, I couldn't stay silent." "That must have cost you." "My marriage for one thing," she said with a sad smile. "Josh couldn't understand why I'd risk my career for just horses," as he put it. 6 months later, he died in a climbing accident. We never reconciled. The admission hung in the air between them, an unexpected moment of vulnerability. Mason recognized the weight of unresolved grief in her voice. He carried enough of his own to know its sound. "We should check on our patients," he said after a moment, offering her a way back to safer conversational ground. They bundled up against the cold and made their way to the barn, Echo trailing behind. Inside, they found Frostfire and Ember huddled together for warmth. The yearling looked marginally better, more alert, its injured legs still raised, but with less trembling. Olivia examined the wound, nodding with satisfaction. "The antibiotics are working, infections receding." Mason checked Frostfire, noting the mare's exhaustion, but also her determination. She stood protectively near her foal, occasionally nudging Ember with her muzzle as if offering encouragement. "They seem to understand we're trying to help," Mason observed. "They do," Olivia confirmed. "These horses have had more human interaction than typical wild Mustangs, though always at a distance. They've been observed, tracked, occasionally darted for blood samples, though we try to minimize handling." She stroked Frostfire's neck gently. "But there's something more going on here. The way they came directly to you, the way they're allowing such close contact now, it's unprecedented." Mason remembered the strange moment of connection he had felt with Frostfire the previous day. You said they might recognize my scent from Afghanistan, but that was years ago and I doubt I ever directly handled these specific horses. No, but scent memory in horses is extraordinarily powerful, Olivia explained. If you handled similar horses from the same genetic line, or even if you were present during research procedures, Mason found memories surfacing. There was one time a research facility outside Kabul. I was called in because one of their test subjects had gone into distress during a procedure, a gray mare remarkably similar to Frostfire. That could be it, Olivia said. Possibly a relative with the same genetic markers. You helped that horse. I stabilized her, Mason said, the scene replaying in his mind. The researchers had been too aggressive with their sampling procedures. I remember being angry about it. I filed a report questioning their protocols. Which would have gone nowhere, Olivia said knowingly. The military branch of the research was notoriously resistant to ethical oversight. Mason nodded, the pieces aligning in his mind. 2 weeks later, our convoy was ambushed. That's when he trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Olivia seemed to understand. When you lost your team. Not all of them, Mason corrected quietly. Just the ones I couldn't save. The confession hung in the cold air of the barn. Frostfire nickered softly as if responding to his pain and pressed her muzzle against his arm, the same comforting gesture she'd shown toward Ember. Mason stiffened, then slowly relaxed, allowing the unexpected contact. Something passed between man and horse in that moment, a recognition of shared trauma perhaps, or simply the wordless comfort one living being can offer another. We need to get moving, Olivia said, gently breaking the silence. The storm might ease briefly this afternoon. It could be our only window to search for Thunderstrike and begin transport preparations. Mason nodded, pulling himself back from the edge of memory. I'll gather supplies. We'll need the snowshoes and emergency gear if we're going into the canyon. As they exited the barn, the distant sound of engines cut through the howling wind, snowmobiles approaching from the east again. Mason grabbed Olivia's arm, pulling her behind the corner of the building. Echo growled low in his throat, hackles rising. They're back, Mason whispered. Peering cautiously around the edge, 3 snowmobiles emerged from the white haze, moving in the same tight formation as before. This time they didn't maintain their distance, but headed directly for the cabin. They're not being subtle anymore, Olivia observed grimly. They must be getting desperate. Or they know the horses are here, Mason countered. We need to get back inside, grab my rifle. No, Olivia hissed. If we engage them directly, they'll just bring in more forces. We need to disappear with the horses. Into a blizzard, that's suicide. Not if we follow my original plan. My vehicle can handle this terrain, and I know these mountains almost as well as you do. Mason hesitated, calculating since rapidly. The approaching riders would reach the cabin in less than a minute. Once they discovered the horses in the barn, any chance of peaceful resolution would vanish. Fine, he decided, but we'll need a distraction. Without waiting for her response, Mason whistled sharply to Echo. The wolf dog looked at him attentively, awaiting command. Echo heard. Mason commanded a signal he had taught the animal for moving wildlife away from the cabin. Echo immediately sprinted toward the approaching snowmobiles, barking fiercely. The lead rider swerved in surprise, nearly colliding with his companions. The wolf dog darted between them, creating confusion without coming close enough to be shot. That won't hold them long, Mason said. Get to your vehicle and start it up. I'll prepare the horses. Olivia nodded and dashed through the deep snow toward her tracked vehicle, half hidden behind a snowdrift. Mason returned to the barn, heart pounding with adrenaline. Frostfire and Ember were agitated, sensing the commotion outside. Mason worked quickly, securing the makeshift halter on the mare and fashioning another for the yearling. We're leaving, he told them, feeling foolish for talking to animals but unable to stop himself. I need you to trust me. To his amazement, Frostfire lowered her head, allowing him to attach a lead rope. Ember was more reluctant, but followed its mother's example. Outside, Echo's diversionary tactics had worked temporarily. The snowmobiles were scattered, their riders trying to corral the elusive wolf dog. Olivia had managed to start her vehicle and was maneuvering it closer to the barn. The rear compartment was designed for wildlife transport with reinforced walls and a ramp for loading. Mason led Frostfire toward it, the mare moving cautiously but without resistance. Getting Ember inside proved more challenging. The yearling balked at the ramp, its injured leg making it hesitant to climb. A shout from near the cabin told Mason they'd been spotted. One of the riders was racing toward them, rifle raised. "Hurry!" Olivia called from the driver's seat. Mason made a split-second decision. He lifted Ember bodily, no small feat given the yearling's size, and half-carried, half-pushed the young horse up the ramp. Frostfire followed immediately, unwilling to be separated from her foal. As Mason secured the compartment door, a bullet pinged off the metal frame inches from his head. He ducked, scrambling toward the passenger door. "Echo!" he shouted, scanning frantically for the wolf dog. The animal appeared from behind a snowdrift, running full tilt toward the vehicle. Mason held the door open, and Echo leaped inside, landing in a flurry of snow across Mason's lap. "Go!" Mason yelled, pulling the door shut as another bullet struck the vehicle's armored side. Olivia gunned the engine, the tracked vehicle lurching forward with surprising speed. They crashed through a snowdrift, then turned sharply west away from both the cabin and the pursuing snowmobiles. "They'll follow our tracks," Mason warned, checking to ensure his rifle was loaded. "Not for long," Olivia replied grimly, steering them toward a narrow passage between two rock formations. "There's another storm front coming in fast. Our tracks will be covered within the hour." She was right already. The wind was intensifying, picking up loose snow and reducing visibility. The snowmobiles would have the advantage of speed in open terrain, but Olivia's tracked vehicle could navigate obstacles they couldn't. Mason looked back at the horses through the small observation window. They were standing side by side, frightened but steady. Frostfire had positioned herself to support Ember, preventing the yearling from being thrown off balance by the vehicle's movements. "Where exactly are we going?" Mason asked, turning back to Olivia. "First, to check the most likely shelter points for Thunderstrike." She answered, her eyes never leaving the treacherous path ahead. "Then, assuming we find him, to our secure facility. And if we don't find him," Olivia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, "then we have a decision to make. The facility is the safest place for Frostfire and Ember, but you don't want to abandon Thunderstrike," Mason finished for her. "Would you?" she challenged. Mason thought of the stallion alone in the deadly storm, possibly injured, like his mate and foal. "No," he admitted, "I wouldn't." The vehicle crawled up a steep incline, its tracks finding purchase where wheels would have failed. At the crest, Olivia paused, checking a GPS device mounted on the dashboard. "First potential shelter point is half a mile ahead," she said. "A rock overhang facing south, natural windbreak, possible protection from snow accumulation." Mason nodded, checking the ammunition in his rifle. The pursuing snowmobiles had fallen behind, but he had no illusions they'd given up. Men willing to hunt horses through a blizzard wouldn't be deterred by a head start in worsening weather. They continued their arduous journey, the wind battering the vehicle relentlessly. Visibility diminished to mere yards, the world beyond their windshield, a swirling white void. Mason marveled at Olivia's navigation skills. She moved with confidence through terrain that all looked identical to him. "How can you possibly know where we are?" he asked after she maneuvered them precisely between two nearly invisible rock formations. "I've been studying these mountains for 4 years," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "Every ridge, every canyon, every seasonal water source. When you track wild horses through wilderness, you learn the land as they know it." There was something in her tone, a deep respect, almost reverence, for both the horses and the landscape. It reminded Mason of his grandfather, who had viewed his ranch not as property to be owned, but as a partnership with the land and its animals. They reached the first shelter point, a curved rock face with a significant overhang partially protected from the wind. Olivia stopped the vehicle, and they both scanned the area for signs of the missing stallion. "Nothing," Mason said after a thorough examination with binoculars. "No tracks, no disturbances in the snow." Olivia consulted her GPS again. "Next location is 2 miles northwest. It's a small cave entrance, barely visible unless you know what you are looking for." As they prepared to continue, a sharp whinny from the transport compartment caught their attention. Frostfire was agitated repeatedly, turning her head toward the north and pawing at the floor. "What's wrong with her?" Mason asked. Olivia's eyes widened. "She senses something, possibly Thunderstrike." "That's impossible. Even horses can't detect another horse miles away in a blizzard." "These aren't ordinary horses," Olivia reminded him. "Their sensory capabilities far exceed what we consider normal." She adjusted their course, heading north instead of northwest. Mason remained skeptical, but said nothing. They'd come this far on trust and intuition. A little more wouldn't hurt. The terrain grew more treacherous, steep slopes, and narrow passages that tested the vehicle's capabilities. Twice, they nearly became stuck in deep drifts, the engine whining in protest as the tracks fought for purchase. Frostfire's agitation increased the further north they traveled. Her whinnies grew more frequent, more urgent. Even Ember joined in despite its weakened condition. "They know something we don't," Olivia insisted. "We're getting closer." The wind shifted suddenly, the blizzard's intensity doubling. Snow lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to almost zero. Olivia was forced to slow to a crawl, navigating more by instruments than sight. "We need to turn back," Mason urged. "We're risking all our lives." "Just a little further," Olivia pleaded. "There's a rock formation ahead that could provide shelter. It's a known gathering point for the herd during storms." Mason was about to argue further when Echo suddenly perked up, ears forward, nose pressed to the window. The wolf dog whined, an unusual sound from the normally stoic animal. "Echo senses something too, Mason admitted reluctantly. They pressed on through the whiteout conditions, the vehicle straining against the deepening snow. Finally, a dark shape materialized ahead, a massive rock formation rising from the white landscape like an island in a frozen sea. Olivia maneuvered them closer, circling toward what appeared to be a protected alcove on the leeward side. As they approached, Mason raised his binoculars again, scanning methodically. "There," he exclaimed. "Movement in the alcove." Olivia stopped the vehicle and squinted through the swirling snow. "I can't see clearly. Is it Thunderstrike?" Mason adjusted the focus on his binoculars. "It's a horse, definitely. Black or very dark brown. Can't tell its a condition from here." In the transport compartment, Frostfire let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the snowfield. A moment later, an answering call came from the rock formation deep in resonant, unmistakably stallion. "It's him," Olivia whispered, relief flooding her face. "It's Thunderstrike." They approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the stallion. As they drew closer, Mason got a better view through his binoculars. Thunderstrike was magnificent, despite his obvious distress, a powerful black stallion with a partially ice-crusted mane, his coat dull from exhaustion, but his posture still proud. "He's injured," Mason observed, noting how the stallion favored his left foreleg. "And he's been here a while. There's a depression in the snow where he's been lying." Olivia parked the vehicle as close to the alcove as possible, then turned to Mason. "This is the tricky part. Wild stallions are notoriously difficult to approach, especially when injured." "Let Frostfire do it," Mason suggested. "Open the compartment. She'll draw him to us." Olivia considered this, then nodded. "It's worth trying, but be ready if he charges. Get back inside immediately." They exited the vehicle, battling against the wind. Mason kept his rifle ready, but pointed downward, hoping they wouldn't need it. Olivia carefully opened the transport compartment, allowing Frostfire to see out but preventing her from exiting fully. The mare whinnied immediately upon seeing her mate. Thunderstrike's head shot up, ears pricked forward. He let out an answering call and attempted to move toward them, but stumbled, clearly in pain. "He won't come to us," Olivia shouted over the wind. "We'll have to go to him." "I'll go," Mason decided. "You stay with Frostfire and Ember." Before she could protest, Mason began trudging through the deep snow toward the injured stallion. He moved slowly, deliberately, hands visible, rifle slung across his back to appear less threatening. Thunderstrike watched his approach warily, nostrils flaring to catch Mason's scent. The stallion's dark eyes reflected both pain and fierce intelligence, assessing the human who dared approach. "Easy," Mason called softly, though his voice was nearly lost in the wind. "I'm here to help." He stopped several yards away, allowing the horse to grow accustomed to his presence. Thunderstrike snorted, pawing the ground with his good foreleg, a warning. Behind him, Frostfire continued to call her, whinnies almost pleading. Mason remained perfectly still, remembering his grandfather's lessons about approaching nervous horses. "Time and patience," the old man had said. "Let them come to you in their own time." Gradually, Thunderstrike's posture relaxed slightly. The stallion took a tentative step forward, then another, still favoring his injured leg. Mason noticed dark stains in the snowblood, partially covered by fresh powder. When the stallion was just a few yards away, Mason slowly extended his hand, palm up. "That's it," he murmured. "You know I helped your family. Now let me help you." To his amazement, Thunderstrike stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he took in Mason's scent. Recognition flickered in those intelligent eyes, whether of Mason specifically or simply of human scent associated with Frostfire and Ember. Mason couldn't tell. The stallion allowed Mason to approach close enough to examine his injury, a deep laceration on his left shoulder, partially frozen at the edges. Not a bullet wound, Mason noted with relief, but likely from a fall or collision while fleeing. "I need to get you to shelter," Mason told the horse. "Your family is waiting." As if understanding, Thunderstrike looked toward the vehicle where Frostfire continued to call. The stallion took a halting step in that direction, then looked back at Mason as if seeking guidance. Mason moved slowly alongside the injured horse, not touching him, but providing a presence to follow. Step by painful step, they made their way across the snow-covered ground toward the waiting vehicle. Olivia watched in astonishment as man and stallion approached together. "That's impossible," she breathed. "I've never seen him allow anyone that close, let alone follow them." When they reached the vehicle, a new challenge presented itself: how to get the injured stallion into the transport compartment. The ramp was narrow, and Thunderstrike was both larger and more skittish than Frostfire and Ember. "We can't force him," Olivia said. "He's too powerful, even injured." "We won't force him," Mason replied. "We'll let his family convince him." He gestured for Olivia to adjust the compartment door, allowing Frostfire to move halfway down the ramp. The mare immediately approached her mate, touching noses in greeting. Their breath mingled in the freezing air, creating a shared cloud of vapor. Ember nickered from inside, and Thunderstrike's ears pricked forward. The stallion seemed torn between his natural caution and his desire to rejoin his family. Frostfire made the decision for him. She returned up the ramp, stopping halfway to look back expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, Thunderstrike followed, limping heavily but determined. Mason and Olivia stood back, hardly daring to breathe, as the stallion carefully navigated the ramp. Once inside, he was immediately greeted by Ember the yearling, pressing close to its sire despite its own injury. "The family reunion's complete," Olivia said softly as they secured the compartment door. "I've never seen anything like it." Mason allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before reality reasserted itself. "We need to move. The storm's getting worse and those men are still out there." They returned to the front of the vehicle, brushing snow from their coats. Echo had remained inside, watching their approach with alert eyes. The wolf dog seemed unusually calm about the addition of another horse, as if understanding the importance of the reunion they'd just witnessed. Olivia started the engine, checking her GPS. "The facility is about 15 miles southwest of here. In these conditions, that's at least 3 hours." "Can the horses last that long?" Mason asked, concerned about both Ember's infection and Thunderstrike's fresh wound. "They'll support each other," Olivia said confidently. "That's what this family does." They set off into the intensifying storm, the vehicle moving more slowly now with its increased load. Mason kept watch for signs of pursuit, but the blizzard had erased all tracks, both theirs and any their hunters might have left. After nearly an hour of arduous progress, they entered a narrow canyon that provided some shelter from the wind. Olivia relaxed slightly, able to navigate with better visibility. "Once we reach the facility, what's the plan?" Mason asked. "Those men won't simply give up." "The facility has security protocols," Olivia explained. "Limited access points, surveillance systems, armed personnel, mostly ex-military, who believe in the ethical research we're conducting." "Sounds like you've been preparing for this." She nodded grimly. "Ever since I blew the whistle, I knew there might be retaliation. The military branch of the project had too much invested to simply walk away. And what about after these horses can't live in a research facility forever?" "No," she agreed. "The ultimate goal is to release them back to their natural range once the situation is resolved. They belong in the wild, not in captivity." Mason glanced back at the horse family through the observation window. Despite their injuries and exhaustion, there was something profoundly dignified about them, a wildness that no human intervention could fully tame. "What about the man leading the search party?" he asked, turning back to Olivia. "The one with the dog tags like my friends." Olivia's expression darkened. "Colonel Wallace. He was the military overseer of the entire project from the beginning. When civilian control was established, he was formally removed, but apparently he didn't accept that decision." "Wallace," Mason repeated the name, stirring vague memories. "I never met him in Afghanistan, but I heard rumors about a colonel who was pushing ethical boundaries on medical research." "That's him," Olivia confirmed. Brilliant mind, absolute conviction that his work is necessary for national security, and complete disregard for ethical constraints. Dangerous combination. Very. And he has powerful allies who look the other way as long as he produces results. Mason pondered this information as they continued through the canyon. The pieces were coming together: his unwitting involvement in the early research, Wallace's determination to recapture the horses, Olivia's desperate effort to protect them. "You realize," he said slowly, "that once we reach your facility, I'm involved for good. Wallace won't distinguish between you and me. We'll both be enemies." "You already are involved, Mason," Olivia pointed out gently. "The moment you helped Frostfire and Ember, you took a side in this." He knew she was right. After years of hiding from responsibility, from connection, from anything that might demand his care, he had committed himself to this cause, to these horses, with a single act of compassion. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, he felt an odd sense of peace, as if a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had been set down. Running from his past had exhausted him more than facing it ever could. A sudden movement caught Mason's eye, a flash of metal through the swirling snow high on the canyon wall to their right. "Stop!" he shouted, reaching for his rifle. Olivia slammed on the brakes just as a shot rang out, the bullet striking the armored windshield and creating a spiderweb of cracks, but not penetrating. "Ambush!" Mason said tersely, scanning the canyon walls. They anticipated our route. More shots followed, pinging off the vehicle's armor. In the transport compartment, the horses shifted nervously, sensing the danger. "We're sitting ducks here," Olivia said, her voice remarkably steady despite the situation. "The armor will hold for now, but we can't stay put." Mason spotted movement on both canyon walls, at least 4 figures in white camouflage moving to surround them. "Can we back up?" he asked. "Not fast enough," Olivia replied. "They'll pick us off before we clear the canyon." "Then we go forward," Mason decided. "Full speed, break through their line." Olivia nodded grimly and shifted gears, the engine roaring as she accelerated. More shots struck the vehicle, one bullet managing to penetrate a weak point in the side panel, embedding itself in the dashboard inches from Olivia's hand. Mason rolled down his window just enough to return fire, not aiming to kill, but to force their attackers to take cover. Echo barked fiercely, agitated by the gunfire, but staying low as Mason had trained him. The vehicle lurched forward, gaining speed despite the difficult terrain. They were approaching a narrowing in the canyon, a natural bottleneck where they'd be most vulnerable. "They'll concentrate fire there," Mason warned, gesturing toward the choke point. "I know," Olivia replied grimly. "Hold on." She swerved suddenly, taking them up a steep embankment on the canyon's left side, a risky maneuver that threatened to overturn the vehicle but might bypass the ambush point. The tracked vehicle strained against the incline, its engine howling in protest. For a terrifying moment, Mason thought they would roll backward, but then the tracks found purchase on a rocky outcropping and they surged forward. Bullets continued to strike around them, but the new angle made targeting more difficult for their attackers. They crested the embankment and found themselves on a narrow ledge that ran parallel to the canyon floor, a game trail enlarged by erosion just wide enough for their vehicle. "That was either brilliant or insane," Mason said, breathing hard. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Olivia replied, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated the treacherous path. The ledge eventually rejoined the canyon floor, a quarter-mile ahead beyond the bottleneck where the ambush had been centered. They'd bypassed the worst of the trap, but Mason knew they weren't safe yet. "They'll be pursuing," he said, checking his rifle's ammunition. "How much farther to the facility?" "About 10 miles, Olivia answered. "But there's another problem." She pointed to a warning light on the dashboard. The fuel gauge was flashing red. "We're leaking fuel," she explained tensely. "One of the bullets must have hit the tank." Mason swore under his breath. "How far can we get?" "Maybe another 3 miles at this speed. 5 if we slow down." "Neither gets us to safety," Mason concluded grimly. They continued in tense silence, both scanning for signs of pursuit while monitoring the rapidly depleting fuel. The horses had grown quieter in the transport compartment, as if sensing the need for stealth. After 2 miles, the engine began to sputter. Olivia guided them toward a small clearing, sheltered by evergreens, their massive boughs heavy with snow, providing natural concealment. "End of the road," she said as the engine died. "We'll have to continue on foot." Mason looked back at the 3 injured horses, then at the blizzard raging around them. "That's not possible. Ember can barely walk, and Thunderstrike isn't much better." "We don't have a choice," Olivia insisted. If we stay here, they'll find us. Mason rubbed his face, mind racing through options. How far to the nearest outpost or cabin? Something smaller than your main facility. Olivia consulted her GPS. There's an emergency shelter about 2 miles west. Basic supplies, radio, medical kit. We sometimes use it during field research. 2 miles we can manage, Mason decided, even with injured horses. They worked quickly to prepare for the journey, gathering essential supplies from the vehicle. Mason fashioned crude splints for both Ember and Thunderstrike, while Olivia prepared a pack with medical supplies and emergency rations. Echo seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining unusually focused and attentive. Mason realized the wolf dog would be invaluable for the trek ahead, his senses more reliable than any humans in the blinding snow. We leave no trail if possible, Mason instructed as they prepared to exit the vehicle. Stay in the tree line, use rocky outcroppings when available. Olivia nodded, securing her coat against the biting wind. The horses will follow Frostfire. As long as we can keep her moving in the right direction, they'll stay with us. Getting the horses out of the transport compartment proved easier than expected. Despite their injuries, all three seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. Frostfire took the lead. Ember stayed close to her side, and Thunderstrike would burn in the rear, his powerful presence despite his injury providing a sense of security. They set off into the storm, Echo ranging ahead to scout the path, Mason and Olivia flanking the horses. Progress was painfully slow, every step a battle against deep snow, biting wind, and the animals' injuries. Mason found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for signs of pursuit. The blizzard provided cover, but also blinded them to potential threats. Every shadow among the trees, every sound beneath the wind's howl could signal danger. Olivia moved with surprising confidence, despite the conditions, consulting her GPS occasionally, but mostly navigating by memory and instinct. Mason realized she truly did know this wilderness as intimately as she'd claimed. After nearly an hour of grueling progress, Echo suddenly froze, ears forward, tail straight. The wolf dog growled low in his throat, a warning Mason recognized immediately. "Down," he whispered urgently, pulling Olivia into a crouch behind a snowdrift. The horses sensed the danger too, growing still and alert. Mason strained his eyes against the swirling snow, searching for whatever had triggered Echo's response. Then he saw it, a faint light moving through the trees ahead, the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping methodically across their intended path. "They're between us and the shelter," Mason whispered, his breath forming frost on his beard. "How?" Olivia hissed. "How could they have anticipated our route so precisely?" A cold realization struck Mason. The tracking device, the one you said they found in the snow. What if it wasn't the only one? Understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes. "You think one of the horses is still tagged?" It would explain how they've stayed on our trail despite the storm. Olivia quickly examined Frostfire and Ember, her gloved hands searching through their manes and along their bodies. When she reached Thunderstrike, she paused at his injured shoulder. "Here," she whispered, feeling carefully around the wound. "There's something embedded near the laceration." Using a small pocket knife, she carefully extracted a tiny metal object from the frozen tissue no larger than a grain of rice. "Subcutaneous tracker," she confirmed grimly. "Military grade. That's how they found us at the canyon and how they're ahead of us now." Mason took the device and examined it briefly before crushing it beneath his boot. "Too late to matter now. They already know our position." The light ahead was joined by others, 3, then 4 beams cutting through the darkness. They were methodically sweeping the area, closing in on their position. "We need a diversion," Mason decided. "Something to draw them away while we circle to the shelter." "Well, what did you have in mind?" Olivia asked. Mason looked at Echo, an idea forming. He removed his outer coat, the one with his scent deeply embedded from years of wear, and draped it over the wolf dog's back. "Echo, run," he commanded softly, pointing away from their intended path. "Run and hide, wow." The wolf dog seemed to understand, looking at Mason with intelligent eyes before slipping away into the storm, the coat trailing behind him like a flag. "He'll lead them on a false trail," Mason explained. "Give us time to reach the shelter." "Will he be safe?" Olivia asked, concern evident in her voice. "Echo knows these mountains better than any human," Mason assured her, though worry gnawed at him. "He'll lose them and find us later." They changed course, moving at right angles to their original path before turning toward the shelter. The horses followed obediently, seeming to understand the need for stealth. Behind them, shouts erupted as the searchers spotted Echo's trail. Flashlight beams converged and moved rapidly away, following the false lead. "It's working," Olivia whispered, "but we need to hurry." They pressed on through the deepening snow, the temperature dropping dangerously as night approached. Mason found himself moving on autopilot, his military training taking over, one foot in front of the other, always alert, always protecting his charges. Ember began to falter after another half-mile, the yearling's injured leg finally giving out. Mason wordlessly lifted the young horse, partially supporting its weight, while Olivia guided them forward. Thunderstrike moved closer, his massive body providing some shelter from the wind. Just when Mason thought they couldn't continue any further, Olivia pointed ahead. There, through those trees, a small wooden structure materialized from the white haze, the emergency shelter. It was little more than a reinforced cabin built to withstand the brutal mountain winters, but in that moment it looked like salvation. They approached cautiously, Mason scanning for signs of ambush, while Olivia checked the security code lock on the door. The shelter appeared untouched, its windows, dark snow piled undisturbed against its walls. "Clear," Mason confirmed as Olivia unlocked the door. The interior was Spartan but functional: a small wood stove, basic medical supplies, emergency rations, and a battery-powered radio. Most importantly, it offered shelter from the lethal cold and a defensible position. "What about the horses?" Mason asked as they entered. "There's a lean-to on the back," Olivia explained, already moving to light the stove. "Not ideal, but better than nothing." They worked quickly to settle the horses in the crude shelter, using emergency blankets to provide additional warmth. All three animals were exhausted, willingly accepting the confined space in exchange for respite from the storm. Inside the cabin, Mason secured the door and windows, while Olivia established radio contact with her facility. "Alpha Base, this is Winters," she said into the handset. "Emergency Protocol 7, over." A burst of static, then a male voice responded. "Copy that, Winters. Condition of subjects, over." All three recovered, but injured. Currently at Outpost Echo with Dr. Reed. Hostiles in pursuit, over. Understood. Extraction team dispatched. ETA 12 hours due to storm conditions. Maintain radio silence except for emergencies, over. Copy that. Winters out. She set down the radio and turned to Mason. "Help won't arrive until morning at the earliest." Mason had expected as much. "Then we defend this position until they get here." He moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the shutters. The storm had intensified again. Visibility reduced to mere feet. For now, at least, nature was their ally, concealing their location from pursuers. "You should rest," he told Olivia. "I'll take first watch." She looked ready to argue, but then nodded, fatigue evident in her posture. "Wake me in 4 hours." Mason checked on the horses one more time before settling in by the window, rifle across his knees. Outside, the blizzard raged unchecked, a white fury that both imprisoned and protected them. He found his thoughts turning to Echo, hoping the wolf dog had successfully evaded their pursuers and found safe shelter. The animal had become his only companion during 3 years of self-imposed exile, the only living being Mason had allowed himself to care about. Until now. His gaze shifted to Olivia, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the small cot, then to the lean-to, where 3 remarkable horses huddled together against the cold. Somehow, in the midst of danger and pursuit, Mason Reed had found himself part of a makeshift family responsible for lives other than his own for the first time since Afghanistan. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a quiet resolve. He had failed to protect his team once before. He would not fail again. As night deepened and the storm howled its ancient fury, Mason kept his vigil, a sentinel against the darkness that threatened both from without and within. The night passed in tense vigilance. Mason and Olivia, alternating watches, the blizzard raged around their shelter. Near dawn, the storm's fury began to subside, the howling wind gradually diminishing to a mournful whisper. First light revealed a transformed landscape. Snowdrifts taller than a man, trees bent under white burdens, the world remade in crystalline white. Mason stood at the window, scanning the pristine expanse surrounding the shelter. No tracks marred the snow. No movement disturbed the stillness. Their pursuers had either lost their trail completely or were biding their time, waiting for them to make a move. "Anything?" Olivia asked, joining him at the window. Mason shook his head. "Nothing, too quiet." "The extraction team should reach us in a few hours," she said, checking her watch, "assuming the weather holds." Wallace won't wait that long, Mason replied grimly. He knows we're in this area even if he's lost our exact position. He'll be sweeping systematically and daylight gives him the advantage. Olivia frowned, acknowledging the truth in his assessment. The horses need attention. I should check their wounds. They moved to the lean-to, where Frostfire, Ember, and Thunderstrike had passed the night in relative comfort. All three were alert, their intelligent eyes following Mason and Olivia's movements. Ember's infection showed signs of improvement, the antibiotics finally gaining ground against the bacteria. Thunderstrike's shoulder wound looked clean, but painful, the stallion bearing it with stoic dignity. They're holding up remarkably well, Olivia observed, applying fresh bandages to Ember's leg. Wild horses would typically be frantic in such confined quarters, especially a stallion like Thunderstrike. They understand the situation, Mason said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. They know we're trying to help. As if confirming his words, Frostfire gently nudged his arm with her muzzle, a gesture of trust that still caught Mason off guard. He found himself automatically responding, stroking her silver mane with a gentleness his hands hadn't known in years. The bond you've formed with them is extraordinary, Olivia said quietly, especially with Frostfire. It usually takes months or years to earn that level of trust from a wild horse. Mason had no explanation that wouldn't sound fanciful. How could he describe the wordless understanding that had developed between him and these animals? The sense that they recognized something in him, perhaps the same brokenness, the same wary survival instinct that they themselves possessed. A sound outside interrupted his thoughts, faint but distinct in the morning stillness. A low whine followed by scratching at the door. Mason signaled for silence, retrieving his rifle. Olivia positioned herself protectively near the horses, her own handgun drawn. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Mason approached the door cautiously, listening intently. Then a familiar bark made his shoulders sag with relief. "It's Echo," he said quickly, unbolting the door. The wolf dog entered in a flurry of snow, Mason's coat still draped across his back, though torn and frozen in places. Echo circled Mason once, assuring himself his human was unharmed, then dropped to his belly, clearly exhausted from his night in the storm. "Good boy," Mason murmured, kneeling to check the animal for injuries. "You led them away, didn't you?" Echo's tail thumped weakly against the floor. Apart from minor cuts on his paws, the wolf dog appeared unharmed, cold and tired but whole. "He's remarkable," Olivia said, holstering her weapon, "as loyal as the horses." Mason removed the frozen coat from Echo's back, offering the animal water and some of their emergency rations. "He's never let me down," he said simply. As Echo recovered, Mason returned to the window, resuming his watch. The sun had fully risen, now glinting off the snow with blinding brilliance. The beauty of the scene belied the danger that lurked within it. Olivia joined him, her expression troubled. "We need to consider our options if the extraction team doesn't reach us in time." Mason nodded grimly. "We can't stay here indefinitely. Supplies are limited, and this position, while defensible, is ultimately a trap if they discover us. Could we make it to the main facility on foot?" "Not with injured horses," Mason said, shaking his head. "And splitting up isn't an option. They'd pick us off individually." They lapsed into tense silence, each searching for a solution that didn't exist. Outside, the sun continued its slow arc across the winter sky, the shadows gradually shifting as morning matured toward noon. Echo suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward, a low growl building in his throat. Mason immediately went on alert, scanning the tree line through his binoculars. "Movement," he reported tensely. "Eastern perimeter, using the trees for cover." Olivia joined him at the window, squinting against the sun's glare. "How many?" "Wow, at least 3 that I can see. Probably more spread out that I can't." "Wallace," Olivia said grimly. "He's found us." Mason assessed their tactical situation with cold precision. The shelter offered good cover but limited escape routes. They were outnumbered and once surrounded would be trapped. "We need to move," he decided, "now while we still have a chance of breaking through their perimeter." Olivia looked uncertain. "The horses are still weak, and the extraction team won't get here in time," Mason finished for her. "We either move now on our terms or we're forced out on theirs." She considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Where do we go?" Mason studied the topographical map on the shelter wall, tracing potential routes with his finger. "There's a ravine about a mile northwest of here. Difficult terrain, but it leads toward your facility, and provides cover along most of its length. The horses can handle it. They'll have to. They prepared swiftly, gathering essential supplies and readying the horses. Mason crafted a makeshift travois from shelter materials, a crude but functional sled that could support Ember if the yearling couldn't manage the entire journey on foot. Olivia established brief radio contact with her team, updating their situation in coded language. The extraction team had been delayed by road conditions, but was still inbound, now approaching from the northwest, potentially intercepting them if they could reach the ravine. As they prepared to depart, Mason took one final look through the window. The figures in the tree line had grown bolder, advancing slowly toward the shelter. Soon they would have the building surrounded. "We leave through the back," he instructed, checking his rifle one last time. "Stay in the tree shadows as much as possible. I'll take point, you bring up the rear. Echo will run flank security." Olivia nodded, her earlier uncertainty replaced by focused determination. The scientific researcher had receded, revealing the military training beneath a transformation Mason recognized from his own combat experiences. They led the horses quietly from the lean-to, using the shelter's bulk to conceal their movements. Frostfire seemed to understand the need for stealth, moving with careful precision despite her exhaustion. Thunderstrike followed her lead, his powerful presence a reassurance despite his injury. Ember, the weakest of the three, leaned against the travois but remained standing, drawing strength from its family's proximity. Mason signaled Echo forward, the wolf dog immediately understanding his role. The animal moved ahead, scouting their path, his senses far more acute than any humans. They slipped away from the shelter like ghosts, using the trees for cover, moving in short bursts between concealed positions. Mason's military training resurfaced fully now. The careful scanning of sightlines, the silent hand signals, the measured breathing that kept panic at bay. They had covered perhaps a quarter mile when the first shot rang out, a single crack that echoed across the snow-covered landscape. Not aimed at them, Mason realized immediately, but fired at the shelter they'd abandoned. "They're testing if we're still inside," he whispered to Olivia. "When they get no response, they'll realize we've gone and start searching." "How long do we have?" "Minutes, keep moving." They increased their pace, still maintaining caution, but prioritizing distance over perfect concealment. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the ravine, steep slopes and rock outcroppings that would have been difficult even without injured horses. Ember was struggling now, its wounded leg trembling with each step. Mason adjusted the travois, allowing the yearling to rest more of its weight on the makeshift sled. Thunderstrike positioned himself on the young horse's weaker side, his massive body providing both physical support and protection. Echo suddenly returned from his forward position, moving with urgent purpose. The wolf dog circled Mason once, then pointed with his body toward the northwest, a warning. "Movement ahead," Mason translated, signaling for everyone to halt and take cover. Through his binoculars, he spotted figures moving along the ravine's edge, the very route they had been planning to take. Wallace had anticipated their escape path and positioned men to intercept them. "They've cut us off, Mason said grimly, lowering the binoculars. "The ravine is blocked." Olivia's face tightened with concern. "Options." Mason scanned their surroundings, mind racing through rapidly diminishing possibilities. The eastern approach was compromised, the northwestern route blocked. South would take them back toward the cabin and certain capture. West, he decided finally, through the old-growth forest. The trees are dense enough to provide cover, and the terrain might slow down pursuers on snowmobiles. "That takes us away from the extraction point," Olivia pointed out. "Can't be helped. We'll circle back when we can." Before they could move, a voice called out from behind them, calm, authoritative, and chillingly familiar to Mason, though he couldn't immediately place it. "Dr. Reed, Dr. Winters, this pursuit is unnecessary and dangerous for all involved. I suggest you surrender now." Mason signaled for everyone to remain still and silent. The voice continued, amplified by some device to carry across the distance. "We have no interest in harming you. Our only concern is recovering valuable government property. Surrender the horses and you're free to go." Olivia's eyes flashed with anger. "They're not property," she whispered fiercely. The voice closer now took on a harder edge. "You have 30 seconds to respond, or we will assume hostile intent and act accordingly." Mason caught Olivia's gaze, communicating silently. They had no intention of surrendering, but neither could they remain in place. Their only hope was to use the ultimatum as a distraction and slip away to the west. He motioned for her to prepare the horses, then unslinging his rifle, aimed carefully at a snow-laden branch far to their east. The shot cracked through the stillness, the branch collapsing under its burden, creating a minor avalanche of snow and a perfect distraction. Immediately, fire concentrated on that position, multiple weapons discharging at once, chewing through bark and branch where they believed the shot had originated. Now, Mason hissed, already moving westward, keeping low. They used the confusion to gain ground, pushing deeper into the old-growth forest, where massive pines some centuries old created a natural labyrinth. The horses moved with surprising agility despite their injuries, seeming to understand the gravity of the situation. Behind them, shouts of anger erupted as their deception was discovered. The pursuit resumed with renewed intensity, but the dense forest worked in their favor, making direct approach difficult for their hunters. They maintained a grueling pace for nearly an hour, changing direction frequently to confuse pursuit. Echo ranged ahead and behind, acting as their early warning system, while Mason and Olivia guided the horses through the challenging terrain. When they finally paused to rest in a small clearing, all three horses were showing signs of extreme fatigue. Ember could barely stand, even with the travois supporting much of its weight. Frostfire and Thunderstrike, though stronger, were clearly reaching their limits. "They can't go much further," Olivia said, checking Ember's bandages, which had begun to seep blood again. "We're pushing them beyond endurance." Mason knew she was right. The horses had already demonstrated extraordinary stamina and courage, but they were still flesh and blood with natural limits. They needed proper medical care, not this desperate flight through wilderness. "We need to find a defensive position," he decided. "Somewhere we can hold out until your extraction team reaches us." Olivia consulted her GPS, studying the surrounding terrain. "There's an outcropping at about half a mile north, a rock formation with a natural overhang, defensible with clear sight lines." Mason nodded. "That's our best option, but we'll need to be careful. They're probably monitoring for electronic signals." They moved out again, Mason taking point while Olivia guided the exhausted horses. Echo had grown unusually alert, his behavior suggesting their pursuers were drawing closer despite the evasive tactics. The rock formation appeared as they crested a small rise, a massive granite outcropping thrust up from the forest floor, its face weathered by centuries of wind and rain into a natural fortress. A deep overhang created a sheltered space beneath, large enough for the horses and humans both. "Perfect," Mason said, scanning the surrounding forest with his binoculars. Natural cover limited approach's elevated position. They maneuvered the horses into the sheltered area, Ember immediately collapsing onto the ground once inside. Frostfire and Thunderstrike remained standing, but lowered their heads in exhaustion, their sides heaving from exertion. Olivia tended to the animals while Mason established a defensive perimeter, identifying potential firing positions and escape routes. Echo patrolled the edges of their position, his senses far more reliable than any human technology. "How long can we hold here?" Olivia asked, joining Mason at his observation point. "Depends on their numbers and how badly they want those horses," he replied honestly. "We have limited ammunition and no backup plans. The extraction team should be looking for us by now. If I could risk a radio call—" "Too dangerous," Mason interrupted. "They're definitely monitoring frequencies." She nodded reluctantly, accepting his assessment. They settled into tense waiting, each scanning different approaches for signs of pursuit. The forest had grown oddly quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife, absent a clear indication that humans were moving through the area. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the branches above them still and silent against the blue winter sky. Echo suddenly went rigid, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. Mason immediately raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. "I see them," he whispered, "multiple positions moving to surround us." Olivia drew her own weapon, taking up position at the opposite side of their shelter. "How many?" "At least 6 that I can see. Well-armed tactical formation." Inside the sheltered overhang, the horses had grown unnaturally still, their ears pricked forward, bodies tense with awareness of the approaching threat. Even Ember had struggled back to its feet, standing close to Frostfire's protective presence. A voice called out from the forest edge, the same authoritative tone they'd heard earlier. "Dr. Reed, Dr. Winters, you've led us on quite a chase, but it ends here. I'm coming forward to speak with you directly. I'll be unarmed." Mason kept his rifle trained on the tree line, skeptical of the offer. After a moment, a figure emerged from the forest, a man in his mid-50s with silver-streaked hair cut military short, wearing winter tactical gear without visible weapons. Around his neck hung dog tags identical to those in Mason's pocket watch photo. "Colonel Wallace, I presume," Mason called, not lowering his rifle. The man inclined his head slightly. "And you're Dr. Mason Reed, former combat surgeon, Medal of Honor recipient, officially listed as killed in action in Afghanistan 4 years ago." A thin smile crossed his weathered face. "Quite a resurrection." "What do you want, Wallace?" Mason demanded, ignoring the bait. "Precisely what I said before the horses, nothing more." Wallace took another step forward, hands held open at his sides. "They're government property, part of a classified research program vital to national security." "They're living creatures," Olivia interjected angrily. "Sentient beings you've tortured in the name of science." Wallace's expression hardened slightly. "Your emotional attachment is clouding your scientific judgment, Dr. Winters. These animals represent potentially life-saving medical breakthroughs. Their genetic material could lead to treatments for toxin exposures that currently have no countermeasures." "We both know that's not all you were developing," she shot back. "I saw the weapons research files before you had them purged from the system." Wallace shrugged, unrepentant. "Defense and medicine have always been intertwined. The same research that creates vaccines can create biological weapons and the countermeasures to such weapons." He turned his attention back to Mason. "You understand this better than most, Dr. Reed. Your work in Afghanistan was laying the groundwork for exactly these kinds of advances." "I was lied to about the nature of my research," Mason replied coldly, "just as Dr. Winters was." "You were doing your duty," Wallace countered. "As was I. As I still am." He gestured toward the overhang where the horses stood. "Those animals represent years of work and millions in research funding. More importantly, they represent potential protection for American soldiers against biological attacks." Mason kept his rifle steady, but doubt flickered briefly across his face. As a military doctor, he had seen firsthand the horrors of modern warfare, including suspected biological agents. The promise of protection against such weapons was powerful. Wallace, sensing the momentary uncertainty, pressed his advantage. "I'm authorized to offer you both full immunity, return to the program, continue your work under proper supervision, and all this unpleasantness disappears." "And the horses?" Olivia demanded. "Will be treated humanely within the parameters of necessary research," Wallace assured smoothly. "You can oversee their care personally, Dr. Winters." Mason studied the colonel's face, reading the calculated sincerity there. Wallace was a skilled manipulator, offering just enough truth to make his lies palatable. But something about his demeanor struck Mason as familiar, the same cool detachment he'd seen in certain officers who viewed casualties as acceptable costs rather than human tragedies. "There's something you're not telling us," Mason said, a cold certainty forming in his gut. "About Afghanistan, about what happened to my unit." A flicker of surprise crossed Wallace's face, quickly masked. "Ancient history, Doctor. Irrelevant to our current situation." "I don't think it is," Mason insisted, memories crystallizing. "I filed reports questioning the ethics of the research protocols reports that went through your office. 2 weeks later, my unit was ambushed in a supposedly secure area. That was never explained." Wallace's expression hardened. "Fog of war, Doctor. Unfortunate coincidences." "I don't believe in coincidences anymore, Colonel." Behind them, Frostfire suddenly nickered sharply, an alert rather than a distress call. Thunderstrike responded with a deep rumbling sound in his chest, moving to position himself protectively in front of his family. Wallace's gaze shifted to the horses, a calculating look entering his eyes. They sensed something. Remarkable animals, truly. Their perceptive abilities far exceed normal equines. "Last chance, Colonel," Mason said, tightening his grip on the rifle. "Walk away. Leave the horses with us." Wallace sighed, a theatrical gesture of regret. "I was hoping for a reasonable resolution, but I see that won't be possible." He stepped backward, still facing them. "For what it's worth, I do regret what happened to your unit. It wasn't personal, simply necessary for operational security." The admission so casually delivered struck Mason like a physical blow. "You ordered the ambush?" he said, voice barely audible. You tried to have us all killed because of my reports. Not all of you, Wallace corrected coldly. Just you. The others were collateral damage. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Mason's veins. His finger tightened on the trigger, the colonel's chest centered in his sights. Mason, don't, Olivia said urgently. It's what he wants justification to open fire. With supreme effort, Mason held his position, not firing but not lowering his weapon either. You murdered my friends, he said, each word precise and deadly. For what? To protect your precious research. To protect American interest, Wallace replied unapologetically. Individual lives, even valuable ones like your team's, must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. Surely as a military man, you understand this calculus. There's nothing military about murdering your own people, Mason spat. Wallace's expression turned pitying. This moral outrage is why you were never suited for the true nature of the work, Doctor. Too many scruples, too much empathy. He glanced at his watch. I've given you every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. What happens next is on your conscience. He raised his hand in a clear signal, and immediately the forest erupted with movement. Armed figures advancing from multiple positions, weapons raised. Take cover, Mason shouted, firing a warning shot above Wallace's head. The colonel dove for protection as gunfire erupted from both sides. Mason and Olivia retreated to the overhang using the rock formation for cover, while returning fire, strategically aiming to suppress rather than kill, conserving their limited ammunition. Inside their stone shelter, the horses grew agitated, but remarkably did not panic. Echo positioned himself at the entrance, snarling at any movement from the forest edge. We're pinned down, Olivia shouted over the gunfire. They're trying to flank us from the north. Mason adjusted his position, picking off a figure, attempting to circle behind their position. We need to hold out until your extraction team arrives. How long? Olivia checked her watch. Should be close now, but without radio contact. Her words were cut short by a new sound, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors approaching from the west. Both sides paused in their firing heads, turning toward the sound. That's not Wallace's, Olivia said, hope lighting her features. Military helicopters have a different sound pattern. The helicopter appeared moments later, cresting the ridge to their west, a civilian model painted with wildlife service markings. It circled once overhead, then hovered at a distance, assessing the situation. Wallace's men immediately redirected their fire toward the aircraft, forcing it to pull back to a safer distance. They can't land under fire, Mason observed grimly. Then we need to clear a landing zone, Olivia replied, determination hardening her voice. Before Mason could respond, movement from within their shelter caught his attention. Thunderstrike had stepped forward, positioning himself at the edge of the overhang, his powerful body tense with purpose. The stallion pawed the ground once, then let out a piercing call that echoed across the clearing. Frostfire moved to his side, adding her voice to his. Even Ember struggled forward, the three horses forming a unified front, their calls merging into a primal chorus that seemed to vibrate through the very rock around them. What are they doing? Mason asked, bewildered. Olivia's eyes widened in understanding. Calling for help. From the forest beyond Wallace's position came an answering call, then another and another. Multiple horses, their voices carrying through the winter air with unmistakable intent. Wallace's men turned in confusion as movement appeared at the forest edge, not the extraction team, but horses. Wild horses emerging from the trees in a coordinated group, at least a dozen strong. The rest of the herd, Olivia breathed in astonishment. They came for their family. The wild Mustangs charged into the clearing, their hooves thundering against the snow-packed ground. Wallace's men scattered in panic, their tactical formation dissolving in the face of this unexpected assault. Thunderstrike bugled again, a sound of triumph and recognition. The lead mare of the approaching herd responded, guiding the Mustangs in a sweeping pattern that effectively scattered the armed men without directly engaging them. In the confusion, the helicopter swooped lower, hovering just above a flat area nearby. A side door slid open, revealing armed personnel in wildlife service uniforms, providing covering fire as a rope ladder deployed. Now, Olivia shouted, this is our chance. They moved quickly, guiding the injured horses from their shelter toward the helicopter. Ember struggled its strength, nearly spent, but with Frostfire's encouragement and Mason's support, the yearling managed to stay upright. Wallace, seeing his quarry escaping, emerged from cover with pistol drawn. Reed, he shouted over the helicopter's roar. This isn't over. Mason turned a rifle raised, finding the colonel in his sights once more. For a heartbeat time seemed to suspend the man responsible for his friend's deaths, for years of grief and guilt, stood vulnerable before him. His finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. "It is for me," he said, though the words were lost in the helicopter's noise. He turned away, helping Olivia secure the horses as the wildlife team deployed a special harness system designed for animal transport. The wild herd continued their protective circling, keeping Wallace's men at bay through sheer intimidation and numbers. Echo leaped into the helicopter first, followed by Olivia. Mason helped secure Ember in the transport harness, then Frostfire. As Thunderstrike was being prepared, Wallace made a desperate rush toward them, firing wildly. Mason dove for cover, returning fire with practiced precision. His shot caught Wallace in the shoulder, spinning the colonel to the ground. Their eyes met across the distance, icy calculation meeting burning resolve. "Mason, come on!" Olivia shouted from the helicopter. He backed toward the aircraft, keeping his rifle trained on Wallace's fallen form. The colonel struggled to rise, blood staining the snow beneath him. "You can't run forever, Reed," Wallace called, his voice strained with pain. "Those horses will always be government property." Mason paused at the helicopter door, looking back at the remarkable scene: the injured colonel, the scattered tactical team, and the proud wild horses still circling in protective formation. "They were never yours to own," he replied, loud enough to carry across the distance. "Some things aren't meant to be controlled." He climbed aboard, and the helicopter immediately gained altitude. Through the window, Mason watched as the wild herd melted back into the forest, their mission accomplished. Wallace's diminishing figure continued to shout something, lost to the wind and rotor noise. Inside the aircraft, Olivia was already tending to the horses, administering emergency treatment with the help of a team medic. Ember had finally collapsed from exhaustion, but was breathing steadily. Frostfire stood watchful beside her foal, while Thunderstrike maintained his protective stance despite the confined space. "They'll be okay," Olivia assured Mason, noticing his concerned expression. "They're stronger than they look." Mason nodded absently, stroking Echo's head as the wolf dog pressed against his leg. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Where are we going?" he asked as the helicopter banked westward. "Our main facility near Glacier National Park," Olivia replied. "It's equipped for specialized veterinary care and has security protocols in place. Wallace won't be able to reach them there." "He won't give up," Mason warned. "Men like that never do." "No," she agreed, "but we've bought time and we have evidence of his unauthorized operation now. My contacts in Washington will be very interested in what happened here today." Mason gazed out the window at the wilderness passing below the mountains and forests that had been his refuge for 3 years, both prison and sanctuary. He had fled there to escape his past, only to have it find him anyway, carried on the wings of a storm and the backs of wild horses. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, the question directed as much to himself as to Olivia. She met his gaze, understanding the deeper implications of his words. "That depends on you. You could disappear again. We'd help you establish a new identity somewhere Wallace would never find you." The offer was tempting, the familiar path of avoidance and isolation that had become his default. But something had changed in Mason during these past days. The connection he'd formed with the horses, with Echo, with Olivia herself, had awakened parts of him he'd thought long dead. "Or," he prompted. "Or you could stay," she said simply. "Help us protect them. Your medical skills, your military experience. We could use someone like you, Mason." He considered this, watching as Frostfire gently nuzzled Ember's neck, encouraging the exhausted yearling. Thunderstrike stood nearby, his powerful presence a comfort despite his own injuries. A family supporting each other through trauma and recovery. "I've been running for a long time," Mason admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "From what happened in Afghanistan, from my failure to save them." "You didn't fail," Olivia said gently. "You were betrayed. There's a difference." Mason reached into his pocket, withdrawing the old pocket watch he'd carried for years. Inside, the photograph of his lost team stared back at him, young faces full of life and promise, unaware of the betrayal awaiting them. "Nathan always said I took too much responsibility for things I couldn't control," he murmured, touching the image gently. "I never listened." "Maybe it's time you did," Olivia suggested. Mason closed the watch, but instead of returning it to his pocket, He placed it on the seat beside him, not discarding it, but no longer keeping it hidden away. A small gesture, but significant. "I'll stay," he decided finally, "at least until they're healed." Olivia smiled relief and something warmer lighting her eyes. One step at a time, the helicopter continued westward, carrying them away from danger and toward an uncertain future. Mason felt no great epiphany, no dramatic resolution to years of grief and guilt. But as he watched the horses, saw their quiet resilience in the face of trauma, he recognized something he'd been missing in his isolation, the healing power of connection of purpose beyond mere survival. Echo shifted against his leg, the wolf dog's steady presence and a reminder that Mason had never been truly alone, even in his self-imposed exile. And now, surrounded by these remarkable horses and the woman who had fought so hard to protect them, he felt the first tentative stirrings of belonging. The wilderness below gave way to more cultivated landscapes as they approached their destination. Mason had no illusions that the danger was past. Wallace would recover or regroup, perhaps find new allies to continue his pursuit. But for now, in this moment, suspended between earth and sky, there was a fragile peace. Frostfire caught his gaze across the helicopter cabin, her intelligent eyes meeting his with what seemed like recognition, acknowledgement of a shared journey. Mason had saved her family. In return, she had helped save something in him he'd thought lost forever. The research facility materialized from the winter landscape like an apparition. A collection of low buildings nestled against the mountainside, their architecture designed to blend with the natural surroundings rather than dominate them. Solar panels glinted on south-facing roofs, and security fencing surrounded the complex, discreetly visible only upon closer approach. The helicopter landed on a pad adjacent to what appeared to be a large veterinary treatment center. Medical staff emerged immediately, moving with practiced efficiency to transfer the injured horses from the helicopter to waiting transport gurneys. Mason watched, impressed by the professionalism and care evident in their handling of the animals. These were not coldly clinical researchers, but people who clearly understood and respected the creatures in their care. "Welcome to Phoenix Station," Olivia said as they disembarked. "Named for the program, but we've reclaimed the symbolism rebirth rather than weaponization." She guided him through the facility while the medical team whisked the horses away for treatment. Echo padded alongside them, drawing curious but not unfriendly glances from the staff they passed. "We have 20 full-time researchers here," Olivia explained, plus veterinary staff and security. "Everyone's been carefully vetted. Most were part of the original civilian research team before the military branch took over." "And they all know about the special nature of these horses?" Mason asked. Olivia nodded. "Everyone here understands what makes this herd unique and why protecting them is so important, both for science and for the horses themselves." They reached a comfortable observation room overlooking a large medical treatment area where the team was already attending to Ember. Advanced equipment lined the walls, far more sophisticated than Mason would have expected for veterinary care. "Impressive setup," he commented, watching as an ultrasound was performed on Ember's injured leg. "We've had generous private funding since separating from the military program," Olivia explained. "Ethical research into unique genetic traits has applications far beyond weapons development, cancer treatment, immunotherapy, vaccine development. All without harming the horses," Mason noted approvingly. "Exactly. We've developed minimally invasive samplings techniques, behavioral research protocols that don't require restraint or stress, and genetic analysis methods that require only microscopic tissue samples." Through the window, Mason could see Frostfire and Thunderstrike being treated in adjacent stalls, close enough to maintain visual contact with each other and with Ember. Despite the clinical setting, the horses appeared remarkably calm, as if understanding they were finally safe. "What's the prognosis?" Mason asked, nodding toward Ember. "Very good," Olivia replied, reviewing data on a nearby monitor. "The infection is responding to treatment, and there's no permanent damage to the tendon or bone. With proper care, complete recovery is expected within a few weeks. And then, eventually they'll be released back to their natural range once we're certain Wallace's operation has been fully dismantled." She glanced at him. "We'd like you to be part of that process if you're willing." The offer caught Mason by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "I'm not a wildlife biologist or a veterinarian." "No, but you have a connection with these horses that defies explanation," Olivia said, "particularly with Frostfire. That kind of bond is invaluable during rehabilitation and release planning. Mason considered this as he watched the medical team work. His training was in human medicine, but the principles weren't so different. And there was something appealing about seeing the journey through to its conclusion, following these remarkable animals from rescue to recovery to freedom. "I'd like that," he said finally. Olivia smiled a relief evident in her expression. "Good. In the meantime, we've prepared quarters for you here at the facility. Nothing fancy but comfortable enough. And Echo is welcome, of course. We have several working dogs on site. He'll fit right in." As if understanding, Echo wagged his tail briefly before returning to his vigilant observation of the horses below. A staff member approached with a tablet computer speaking quietly to Olivia about security protocols and communications with federal authorities regarding Wallace's operation. Mason used the opportunity to study the facility more closely, noting the careful balance between advanced research capabilities and animal welfare considerations. This was not the cold military installation he'd half expected, nor was it a purely sentimental animal sanctuary. It was something else, a place where science and compassion coexisted, where the unique value of these horses was recognized without reducing them to mere research subjects. When Olivia finished her conversation, she turned back to Mason with a more serious expression. "There's something else we need to discuss, about Wallace." Mason tensed slightly. "What about him?" "He's been transported to a hospital under federal custody, but he's already claiming the operation was officially sanctioned. Given his connections, there's a risk he might avoid serious consequences." "Unless there's evidence proving otherwise," Mason surmised. "Exactly. Your testimony about Afghanistan combined with what happened here, it could be crucial in preventing him from regaining control of the research program." Mason had expected this moment, had known since the helicopter lifted off that his days of anonymity were effectively over. To truly protect the horses, to honor the memory of his lost team, he would need to step back into the world he'd fled, face the military inquiries, the debriefings, perhaps even public testimony. "I'll do whatever's necessary," he said quietly. "Wallace needs to answer for what he's done, all of it." Olivia nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Thank you, Mason. I know that's not an easy decision." "Few worthwhile things are," he replied, thinking of his grandfather's wisdom. Below them, the medical team was completing initial treatments. Ember had been moved to a recovery stall, bedded deeply with clean straw. Frostfire and Thunderstrike were being settled nearby, positioned so the family could maintain visual contact. "Would you like to see them?" Olivia asked, noting Mason's focus. "Yes," he said without hesitation. They made their way down to the treatment area, Echo following closely. The medical staff acknowledged them with respectful nods, but continued their work without interruption, a well-orchestrated dance of professional care. Mason approached Frostfire's stall first. The silver mare recognized him immediately, nickering softly and extending her muzzle over the half door. Without conscious thought, Mason reached out, stroking her forelock gently. "You made it," he said softly. "All of you." Frostfire leaned into his touch, her dark eyes regarding him with that same uncanny intelligence he'd first noticed in the blizzard. There was recognition there, but something more, a connection that transcended the typical boundaries between human and horse. Thunderstrike watched from the adjacent stall, his initial wariness giving way to grudging acceptance. The powerful stallion still maintained his protective stance, but the hostile suspicion he might have shown toward humans was noticeably absent. Ember, drowsy from medication but alert enough to recognize Mason, nickered weakly from the recovery stall. The yearling's eyes, though heavy-lidded, tracked his movement with clear recognition. "They remember everything," Olivia observed quietly. "Every kindness, every protection you offered. Horses don't forget." "Neither do I," Mason replied, thinking of the long path that had led him to this moment, from battlefield medic to recluse to reluctant rescuer. A veterinarian approached, offering Mason a tablet with detailed medical reports on all three horses. He scanned the information, his medical training and allowing him to interpret the data easily. Everything confirmed Olivia's earlier assessment, with proper care that all three would make full recoveries. "The bullet fragment you removed from Ember's leg probably saved the yearling from systemic infection," the vet commented. "Not many people could have performed that procedure under those conditions." Mason shrugged off the compliment, uncomfortable with praise he felt he didn't deserve. "I did what was necessary, that's all." "Sometimes that's enough," Olivia said softly beside him. They spent the remainder of the day settling in Mason to temporary quarters that, while simple, offered more comfort than his isolated cabin had provided in years. Echo to a specially prepared area that accommodated his semi-wild nature while keeping him close to Mason. As evening approached, Mason found himself drawn back to the recovery area. The facility had quieted for the night, most staff having departed except for essential medical personnel. He stood at the observation window watching the three horses in their adjacent stalls. Frostfire and Thunderstrike had positioned themselves as close to each other as the dividing wall allowed their bodies aligned, as if sharing warmth despite the physical barrier. Ember rested nearby, occasionally lifting its head to check that both parents remained in sight. A family reunited against impossible odds. Wounded but healing. Wild but willing to accept help when necessary. Mason felt Olivia's presence before she spoke, her quiet footsteps approaching from behind. "They'll be moved to the rehabilitation paddocks tomorrow," she said, coming to stand beside him at the window. "More space, more natural environment, but still protected." Mason nodded, watching as Frostfire gently nuzzled Thunderstrike across the divider. They belong together. "Yes," Olivia agreed softly. "Some bonds can't be broken no matter what forces try to separate them." The simple truth of her words resonated with something deep within Mason, a recognition that perhaps his years of isolation had been a form of self-punishment as much as self-protection. In trying to outrun his grief, he had denied himself the very connections that might have helped him heal. "I spoke with federal authorities while you were getting settled," Olivia continued. "They're very interested in your testimony about Wallace's operation, both past and present. It won't be easy, but with your help, we can ensure he never threatens these horses again." "Whatever it takes," Mason said, his resolve strengthening. "I've been hiding long enough." Echo padded up beside him, the wolf dog's presence a familiar comfort. Mason reached down absently to stroke the animal's damaged ear, a reminder of their first meeting, of the trust that had formed between wounded souls. "What about your cabin?" Olivia asked. "Your things," Mason considered this. The isolated ranger station had been his refuge, his hiding place from a world that believed him dead. It contained few possessions of value beyond practical necessities, except for the photographs he'd kept hidden, the memories he'd tried to outrun. "I'll go back eventually," he decided. "Collect what matters, but not yet." For now his place was here, helping these horses heal, confronting the ghosts of his past, perhaps finding a new purpose in the process. The future remained uncertain, the threat from Wallace and his allies not fully eliminated. But for the first time in years, Mason felt something like hope stirring within him. Below in the recovery area, Ember had drifted to sleep, secure in the presence of its parents. Frostfire and Thunderstrike maintained their vigil, their powerful bodies gradually relaxing into rest without surrendering their protective stance. Wild and free spirits, who had nonetheless recognized when to seek help, when to trust, despite all reasons for suspicion. In their resilience, Mason saw a path forward for himself, not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual healing, one step at a time. Outside the facility windows, snow began to fall again, not the violent blizzard that had brought them together, but gentle flakes drifting through the night air. Nature's reminder that even the harshest winters eventually yield to spring, that beneath the frozen landscape, life persists, waiting for its moment to emerge once more. Echo pressed against Mason's leg. Olivia stood quietly beside him, and three remarkable horses rested peacefully below. Connected by circumstance, bound by shared purpose, healing together in the echoing silence of a winter night. They say the deepest wounds heal the slowest. For Mason Reed, the scars of betrayal and loss had hardened into armor protection that kept the world at bay, but imprisoned his heart. It took three wild spirits, themselves wounded and hunted, to show him that isolation isn't the same as safety, that running doesn't erase the path behind you. In the quiet moments, watching Frostfire, Thunderstrike, and Ember heal this unexpected family bound by blood and survival, Mason found reflections of his own journey. Their trust, given despite every instinct to flee, reminded him of a strength he'd forgotten he possessed. Their reunion against impossible odds whispered of possibilities he'd long abandoned. The wilderness had been his refuge, but also his prison. Now, with each day that passed, with each step these remarkable horses took toward recovery, Mason, too, was finding his way back, not to who he was before Afghanistan, but to who he might yet become. Some bonds transcend words. transcend species, transcend the boundaries we build to protect our wounded hearts. Sometimes the most profound healing begins with a single act of compassion offered without expectation in the moment when it's needed most. For in the end, perhaps we are all like wild horses in a blizzard, seeking shelter, seeking connection, seeking the courage to trust again in a world that has given us every reason to run.